Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I'd like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video is going to be on a modern myth about creativity. And this modern myth is based on a lot of research that's been done on expertise and expertise relationship to creativity and creative achievement as a phenomenon. And so, what modern research shows is that there is a correlation between creativity and expertise up to a point, and there are several studies to show that experts have a different form of creativity than a novice, and experts are better at evaluating whether or not a certain achievement in a field is creative versus a novice. And experts also have a different process for creative achievement and higher forms of creative achievements that their peers would rate as highly creative than novices. And it's also been the case that through case studies and various other um, creative theorizers and philosophers and self-help gurus and psychologists that people have generally have the idea and the notion that expertise is indispensable to create high levels of creativity, which is somewhat true. But this citing or this finding has led people even to go as far as to say that creativity is only due to practice, or creativity is something that's solely a result of expertise. And I just shook my head because I do disagree with this. And there's a reason why I disagree with this. And I'm going to first explicate what I think the argument people are making and why they're making it. So, first off, I think because but besides studies alone that show that expertise is necessary for creativity, if you were to look at, I suppose, somebody who has 15 years of painting experience paint something versus someone who has 3 years of painting experience, and this person who has 15 years has had commissioned jobs, and their creativity or their products have been evaluated by others. If you give the expert the task of creating something, a painting that is creative, meaning that it's novel from a historical vantage point to the field, and you give the amateur the same task, or the person who has 3 years, the journeyman, the same task. 9 out of 10 times, the expert is going to come up with something that other people, including other artists, are going to consider is more creative. And there's factors that go into this, but first and foremost, the reason why this is because whenever you're looking at performance, one thing is true is that um, whether you're talking about mathematics, physics, music, or philosophy, there are a multitude of decisions that you could and can make at any point in time in acting something out. And the quality of decisions you make is going to have something to do with what you can reason out in the real time, relying on your prefrontal cortex and working memory in terms of the relationships and patterns you can pick out in the immediacy of acting, and your long-term memory in terms of the storehouse and library of patterns you have that you're familiar with and that you have habituated yourself towards seeing over time. And so the advantage that the expert has is that some patterns are just consistent, and so it's the case that they show up throughout a multitude of contexts. And it's the case that your ability to call on these patterns or remember these sets of actions is very much dependent on how familiar you are with them, because this comes down to the phenomenon of plasticity and neurocircuitry. So the more you practice various aspects and habituate yourself, various patterns, the easier it is for you to call on those patterns or call on those actions whenever the appropriate stimuli is within the environment that's set for you to set for them to emerge or for them to be elicited. And so the novice has less of that familiar patterns that they can easily recognize. So much of what somebody who's inexperienced is doing is using their working memory. While the issue with working memory is that it can only really account for, let's just say, for most people, 3 to 5 bits of data. And for really exceptional people, meaning people with relatively high IQ, seven slots of memory, and even IQ is, you can improve working memory with practice, but with specifically training memory and things like that. But memory is still, so there's caveats to that, so I'm just going to leave that on the table. But in terms of what most people are doing whenever they're remembering things within a context of patterns and expected outcomes that are more complicated than merely memorization and retrieval, such as mental computations and things like that. Working memory, for the most part, for most people at maximum, is going to have at least 7 slots, to use a metaphor per se, in terms of bits of information it can keep working in its inventory. And so that said, whenever you're trying to do something creative, there's a lot to consider. There's always a lot to consider, especially in the real time when there is some sort of pressure on you, and because you are susceptible to pressure and stress to some extent, you will experience higher levels of cortisol, and you will be needing your prefrontal cortex to keep you steady and goal directed and focused and things like that. So there is an amount of emotional management that you need your prefrontal cortex for. And then there is an amount of computational capacity and retrieval, recall, and uh, pattern recognition that you need your prefrontal cortex. So if you think of this from the standpoint of doing a certain set of jobs, if you had a basketball team, you would not want one player doing everything. And so, oftentimes, whenever you're looking at the journeyman or the amateur, they have more of their prefrontal cortex doing most of the work, rather than putting much of the load on long-term memory instead. And what the expert does is put much of the pattern recognition load and some of, and I'd say, if I'm going to give a rough estimation, 60%, or it depends on how much they practice, but 60% of the computational load on their working memory. They just know what things are going to happen and where things ought to go. And because whenever you look at high level, and so the advantages of, and so when you think of what it means to be creative, think about it like this: if you have too many things to worry about, the likelihood of you coming up with something that's extremely novel under a certain time constraint, so time is important here, the likelihood that you're going to come up with something highly creative and novel within a moment is very slim in comparison to others. It's not about whether or not it's creative or novel with respect to yourself. It's about, are you more creative than other people? That's really, or whoever else is in your domain. And whenever you're looking at who has the more potential to be more creative than their peers, it's usually the expert rather than the novice. And even when people like to cite the example of people who came from other domains and were highly creative in another domain, they usually came with expertise from another domain. They weren't just completely novices. So the idea that somebody who's a completely novice at any and everything, that they don't have a diverse background of skills. They're not dilettantes from the strict words of dilettantes. I think people don't look at the data enough. Like, people just pay attention, I guess, to the conclusions of the studies and don't really look at the statistics and parse them thoroughly enough to really, get the most accurate, uh, just, I guess, conclusion from what they could potentially tell you. And really, whenever you look at um, people, they're not, so you don't have dilettantes and novices doing highly creative things. You have experts from other domains coming into solving a specific problem within another domain and finding some result. But nobody is nobody's really a novice in terms of high levels of creative achievement. I'm only talking about high levels of creative achievement. I'm not talking about general levels of creative achievement or everyday creativity. So I'm not talking about that in the first place. And so, with that said, there's a decided advantage for an expert versus a novice, or a substantive one, in terms of who's going to really do the thing that's creative. Now, because it's like that, a general pattern you're going to see for everyone who has had some high level of creative achievement that people value is that there is a lot of, I suppose you could say, practice that went into their becoming whatever it is that they became. An extended developmental process is what I like to say. And so it's the case that even Malcolm Gladwell came out with the book Outliers, which had things to do with various statistics. Malcolm Gladwell is trying to use the science of nonlinear dynamics to point out why things happen. It's just that Malcolm Gladwell left out too many variables and went for an explanation in areas where, it's like he put it too much. He was too much of a social constructive theorist in that book rather than a pure statistician or scientist. So I'm not saying it's not a good book. It's just that when people who are not scientists try to write about science, they do not know enough about science to get the analytic side of things right. So, and I don't mean right from the standpoint that it agrees with what's already standard within scientific literature. It's just usually it grossly disagrees with a wide set of data or literature that's in another area because they don't know about that area, or people who know about that area because they're not a scientist. They're just doing research in a vacuum away from other people who think about these things. I'm not saying he doesn't talk to people or something like that, but I don't know. So I get the feeling that whenever I read Outliers, I got the impression that he never looked at neuroscience, the neuroscience of expertise per se. He definitely read K. Anders Ericsson's work, but I mean, it also may have to do with when Outliers was written. I don't really know when that book was published, but I'd put it like this: that there's a lot of things that is within the literature within neuroscience and cognitive science and personality theory and achievement and creativity that do not fit with his model of the how and why people are. Would say he was more interested in high levels of success rather than purely creative achievement. But so there's a lot of things that he, I suppose, did not include in his analysis. And so that's something that you see a lot. And so he's a big, I guess, easy target for this argument, but it's the completely practice and expertise driven fallacy of creativity, because you will see whether or not you're talking about Mozart, whether or not you're talking about Da Vinci, whether or not you're talking about Michelangelo, whether or not you're talking about Einstein, whoever you're talking about, even if they're a creative genius, they have a certain level of expertise to them, and usually in more than one domain or one area, which is funny. And that's because they were a part of a very extended developmental process. They all had teachers, and I mean, they all went through a very long, extended developmental process. That's the truth. Like, no person is just eminently creative without going through some kind of developmental process to become a very good, exceptional thing, and usually more than one very good, exceptional thing. Um, and so people see that, and then they assume, oh, well, yeah, that's a thing that it is. That's all it takes. You just have to practice, per se, to do that. No, so there's also people don't look at the studies between expertise and creativity enough, because there's also a point where expertise stops correlating with creativity, and it has to do. I'm not really so when I'm thinking of the statistics, it has to deal with prior creative achievement. So prior creative achievement is guess what, a predictor for latter creative achievement. It's also the case that creative achievement is something that's um, has correlation with age, and the age in which people have peak creative achievement changes with field and expertise over time. So most eminent mathematicians are highly creative by the time that they're anywhere from 22 to 32. And so if you've been studying mathematics your whole life and you have not had a highly creative breakthrough and you're 32 years old, you chances are, I mean, like, there are variables, certainly. So I've said there's a caveat: if you've been studying it seriously your whole life, you haven't had a creative breakthrough, or your best work is probably behind you. Not saying that is the case always, just on average, per se. It's just, it works like that to a certain extent, and there are reasons for why it appears the way that it does, and those things do not come down strictly to. So that may be less true these days than prior, because mathematics certainly has advanced as a field, and this was a statistical average. It's not saying that it works like that for everyone, or that's a truism or something like that, which is why I get a little skeptical of people and their proclamations of what it takes to be creative and things like that, whenever they're coming to their conclusions and espousing their theories and philosophies on what it takes to be highly creative. And I think the problem that people who believe it's all comes down to practice have is that they do not like the fact that IQ matters. They do not like the fact that openness matters, personality dimensions matters, and they do not like the fact that social socioeconomic factors matter. I'm not so Malcolm Gladwell gets that more right than other people do, so I give him credit on that one. But it's the case that there's a confluence of things that people just completely leave out, and that's because a lot of people's interests in creativity is centered within self-help literature, and so most of those things nobody can control. So I guess people can't write books about them, or they can't start their businesses or something about them. But let's talk about neuroplasticity and IQ, because here's another myth that exists that's going around with this literature, is that IQ hurts people after a certain point. So once you have a very, very high IQ, past 135, you're going to find studies that show that IQ can become detrimental after a certain point, because these people can have problems socially integrating and less fulfilling lives, and yada, 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 and blah, blah, blah. The thing it doesn't tell you is the thing it doesn't tell you is most of that is socially, culturally dependent. That's not really IQ dependent. So whenever you parse the data based on IQ alone, and you don't look at socioeconomic status, you don't look at the level of degree of the parents, nor the IQ of the parents, and the level of achievement of the parents, and so on and so forth, you will find things that make it look like the more you have, the more IQ you have, the worse off you have it in the world. I'm going to put it to you like this: most of human achievement comes. I mean, some of it. So IQ is important, and I'm going to explain to you where IQ is important. The idea that IQ alone is important is a ridiculous one, because that's not anything anybody's ever going to be able to say whenever they look at, I guess, achievement itself and count for all the variables. This is not what anybody's going to be able to say. But I will say this, that social cultural things matter a lot. meaning their developmental trajectory, their early childhood, who their parents are, what their parents' income is, how much their parents have achieved and pushes them to achieve, what kind of personality their parents have, and the how open the environment is, and very, 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 very many things. Human beings have so people leave out other aspects of psychology whenever they look at certain factors of psychology, and maybe this is the tendency towards specialization. I'm not really sure. But just because somebody has a high IQ does not mean that they suddenly don't have all the emotions that another person has. And just because they have certain cognitive advantages does not mean they don't need a certain developmental trajectory that is emotionally and socially enriching, just like every other human being needs, in order for them to be a well adapted and integrated person or social being. That's just you. Hey, everybody needs affection and sociality to be socially capable. I'd put it like that. High IQ or low IQ, it doesn't really matter. I always find it fun. I always think it's hilarious that whenever um people don't talk about IQ and the correlation between IQ and lack of sociality when people are talking about antisocial personality disorder. And you want to know why? Because people, I think I think it's this socially and culturally, we do not like the fact that IQ matters in terms of achievement. And I'm going to explain later in this video where it matters. We do not like that. We don't like the fact that there are differences in people that are significant. We also do not like the fact that their IQ has been used from a social standpoint to promote bigotry and racism and things like that, and that it's not a perfect instrument. So it really isn't a perfect instrument or anything like that, but it is valid. It is a valid instrument, and it's not the case that people are the only animals with general intelligence. It's not like so anyways, so it's just that it's reliable. We know it's a thing throughout nature in all animals. Um in all animals, and so, well, at least in a lot of animals. So we don't know really for all animals. I can't say that. It's just there's good reason to believe it's true for all animals. Um, Meaning animals like birds, mammals, and lizards and things like that. It's obviously differentiated across the tiers and things like that, but it seems to be something that nature rolled out across a population, across populations, because it comes down to one's ability to deal with novelty and to process novel situations, and rely on learning through working memory and immediacy. And it makes sense that animals would have that per se, because when you think of, I guess, the fact that the environment changes and creatures have to adapt. If it weren't the case that people, or there wasn't a general capacity for novel reasoning and learning that was a part of any animal, it would be the case that most animals would be dead because life is very self-organizing, and it's the case that context and details matter whenever you're trying to achieve something. And whenever you're looking at nature per se, you can just look at that as just one big system of either things meet their goals or don't meet their goals. And whether or not they meet their goals, they're going to feed themselves and they're young, or they're not going to feed themselves and they're young. And that's as simple as it gets. And that's why IQ matters. And that's why everything has it. Presumably, why everything has it. Or general intelligence, which IQ purports to measure. It doesn't measure it perfectly. That's the truth. But it's the case that it's there. It exists. Like, whether people like it or not, it exists. It's there. And it obviously matters in competition. It obviously matters in competition because speed matters. Speed matters when it comes to gaining opportunities and seizing opportunities, or recognizing opportunities, because, well, that's, you're trying to get the jump on people and so on and so forth. So that's to me what it looks like. Now, also, people don't like the idea that personality matters or temperament matters, because truth is that it does matter in terms of what people, I suppose, pay attention to in the world. So everybody can have an incentive from the social landscape to be more creative or something like that, because it helps to be an entrepreneur or whatever, and people have an interest in making money per se. But that doesn't mean everybody is going to have as many ideas as an open person throughout their lifetime. Openness to experience makes it such that people are willing to do things that make it. So I'd put it like this. So why does openness to experience matter to creative achievement from, I guess, like a behavioral standpoint? Because open people take risks and they put themselves in situations where they're likely to be novel. Novel not just to themselves but to other people. Why? Because other people are conservative. So other people don't like danger. Other people don't like danger. Other people don't like what they don't understand. Other people don't like what they're not familiar with. And it's not the case that open people are not human per se. But open people, because they go towards what's unfamiliar and what's risky, they have the opportunity to encounter stimulus, events, activities. Just they gather novel impressions in the world. And if you want to know what's likely for you to come up with like an interesting idea, whether or not you do everything that everybody else does or you just do a whole bunch of things that other people don't do, the chances are whenever you do things that other people don't do, you're going to encounter enough novel impressions for at some point they're going to coalesce with your little pattern seeking mind to some idea that somebody hasn't had before. It's why open people are always trying new things and doing new things, and why people like to travel. That's the real secret behind traveling, I guess, like from a creative standpoint, because whenever, if you just know things other people don't know, then hello, it's like that's going to seem novel to a field because nobody else knows that stuff. And so it's the case that open people have a higher advantage as it pertains to coming up with ideas, also because they daydream. So they run through scenarios and ideas all the time. And so it doesn't mean that they don't have the same ideas that other people have. It's just that they have those ideas much sooner and with higher propensity than other people, such that I've forgotten more things than most people ever knew in their life. I'd put it like that. And so it's the case that has consequences. When you're talking about intellectual achievement or creative achievement, creativity is about ideation. It's not about, so it's partly about ideation. The ideas you have matter a lot in terms of how creative you're going to be. And if you're going to be more creative than everybody else, because it's not about being creative with respect to yourself when you're talking about creative achievement. It's about you being more creative than other people. And if you do what everybody else does, then you're not going to be more creative than everyone else, because you're conditioned to the same set of ideas, habits, and I guess so divergent thinking helps, but you can ask yourself this. You can think about divergent thinking like this. It's all about your initial conditions. So if you start over here and you diverge from there, you're only going to go oh so far, because I hate to break it to you, the human animal does not have infinite knowledge and you don't have infinite imagination. It'll stop at some point, no matter how divergent your thinking is going to be, because you're a locally referential kind of creature. You only refer to things that are within some broader context of your experience, whether that comes through reading or whatever. So it's not going to be the case that you're just going to be that much more open than other people. You're going to have that much more divergent thinking or remote association than other people. Even if you're in the 99th percentile, if you live in Podunk, Idaho, man, it's the case that it's probably not going to happen with respects to history or a world stage. I'd put it like that. And so you don't want to start in Podunk, Idaho. You'd like to go somewhere else to start your launch per se, so that you'll get further. If you start with, I guess, very novel original things to begin with, or less likely phenomena to begin with, then you're probably going to get even more less likely things from that standpoint. So openness matters. Even if people don't necessarily like that, it matters, because most people, one, divergent thinking and remote association is cognitive factors that are associated with create openness to experience. And so it's not like those things don't matter, because in terms of being creative. Now, people don't like those things because you can't necessarily control them, which, well, I mean, that's just the way life is. I don't know what to say other than that, because it's not the case that you can just, um, um I put it like this, expertise certainly helps, but you have it the case that after a certain point in time, expertise stops correlating with creativity, because expertise can only explain for creative achievement oh so much. I mean, there are other meaningful factors per se than just expertise, like opportunity, personality, and IQ. Now, why IQ isn't, I guess, the most important thing is because IQ is another cognitive factor that's a part of creativity. You need IQ to reason through your ideas. You don't need IQ to generate ideas. There are plenty of people with high IQs who are not creative whatsoever fucking ever, and it's the case that personality matters a lot in terms of what you're prone to do or pay attention to in the environment. How well you can reason about something, or what novel situations you're going to put yourself in to sort out in the first place, matters just as much as your ability to reason on a dime per se, to borrow a football expression. How well you reason within, I guess, a novel unscripted situation is depends a lot on the situation in terms of what you're actually going to get and the overall results of the outcome. And so it's not something that guarantees creativity. In fact, IQ itself stops correlating with creativity after you get to 125. They increase monotonically and then completely diverge after that point. And in neuroscience, it's whenever you look at the brain of creative people versus the brain of highly intelligent people, they have different neurophrenology. Their brains just look different from a cellular level, from a cellular standpoint. And so you don't have the same brain as somebody who has just high IQ, because whatever it means to reason very optimally or proficiently in terms of working memory, that doesn't it's not you're not doing the same thing whenever you're coming up with an insight, or having or daydreaming, or having a divergent reverie per se. And so yeah, that's just the way that the data slices itself, and that's consistent with experience and whatever you can evaluate from other contexts like eminent biographies and so on and so forth. Um, Also, it's the case that IQ matter is in this way. So if you have it the case that you're shoveling out opportunities and how quickly people run through ideas per se, how quickly they can consume them and generate them and do something with them, act on those ideas, IQ matters. And so life is not a game of, I guess, big